Okay, folks, welcome. Hello and welcome to today's Public Librarians chat. I just had to have a little technical assistance from my colleague Daniel Cornwall. I'm so grateful that he's right next door. Thank you, Daniel. So today's webinar is on developing conduct policies. And our guest presenter this morning is Andrew Murphy. Sorry about it, I got a phone call. I just have to ignore that. Andrew is the new library director at the State Public Library. During the first part of today's webinar, I will be presenting an overview on why libraries need conduct policies and the policy-making process. And during the second part of the webinar, Andrew will share findings from research he has conducted on the language used by libraries when they write new conduct policies. So according to a 2016 Pew survey, a majority of Americans feel libraries are doing a good job of providing a safe place for people to hang out or spend time. And 69% of survey respondents feel libraries contribute a lot to their communities in this regard. While members of the public may feel and view the library as a safe place to hang out, those of us who work in libraries know this isn't necessarily true. And on August 8th of this year, Public Libraries Online, the online newsletter for Public Library Association, had an article written by Allison Ayak. I'm sorry, somebody has a mic. Could they please mute it? Thank you. I'm going to just write, August 8th of this year, Public Libraries Online had an article written by Allison Ayak describing the sharp increase of 911 phone calls from the Denver Public Library. And in her article, she describes how a local news station sent an undercover reporter to the Denver Public Library, and he documented people injecting drugs and conducting drug deals, often within view of children. And apparently the increase in crime and overdoses at the library were an unintended consequence of Denver's urban camping ban. And in the article, there's this quote by Mayor Michael Hancock. And he says, "We know that in this city and all over this country, we have an opioid epidemic that's taking place. There's no need to hide from it. We know for some reason, probably the uniqueness of the library, that these individuals are attracted to the library." And then the article goes on to describe how the city allocated more funds for more security cameras, and there's a plan to remodel the shelving to reduce the number of possible hiding places in the library. They're going to hire 4 more security guards, and staff are going to be trained in how to administer naloxone, an anti-overdose nasal spray. And the article concludes by stating that the library staff believe they've seen improvements at the library in the increased security, police presence, and the public awareness has helped create a more safe and welcoming environment. What the article fails to mention was whether or not the Denver Public Library had a code of conduct policy and whether or not they were reviewing or revising that policy. So that article was in August, and in June, a couple months prior to that article, there was this article in the American Library published, the American Libraries published an article by Steve Albrecht titled "New Trends in Library Security." And his article described how directors and staff in all parts of the country and in all types of libraries continue to be concerned about challenging patrons who adversely affect library services. And Albrecht's article lists 10 common security problems and solutions. And I've just posted a few of the common security problems that he mentions in his article. One of them he mentions, which isn't on this list, is outdated codes of conduct. And so in his article, Albrecht says, "The best code of conduct is one that shifts with the times, adjusting to new, reasonable uses of the facility by patrons and new security concerns related to the workplace." And the solution he offers is changes and updates to your code of conduct as they relate to safety and security improvements should be an all-staff discussion. You should spend staff time talking about what needs to be added or what language should be adjusted. Get feedback from patrons using formal surveys or staff conversations. Your reward for being vigilant about safety and security for your library today is that you get to do it all over again on tomorrow. So my question for all of you, and you can share it in the chat or you can just mic it. I'll go ahead and mute my own mic. Is what are some trends that you're experiencing in your library that aren't included on this list?
I'll throw in one. We're seeing a fair amount of domestic violence-related incidents, and just obviously just seeing people that are living in that situation right now, whether or not they're dealing with their partner, remotely over the internet or over the phone, or whether or not like both individuals are using the library and engaging in mutual or one-sided DV in the library.
Okay, so hopefully everybody heard that Robert was sharing that in his library he's seen more incidences of domestic violence in his library. We have somebody added in the chat box people submitting taxes on library computers and also PSD applications. Okay. So those are probably, you're thinking of security concerns of their own personal security. Any other issues?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, just people putting in their Social Security number on library computers thinking they're completely secure, and I don't know that they are. We tell them they are not. So.
Okay. Okay, anything else? Okay, we'll just move it on here. So libraries are committed to providing their patrons with a safe and welcoming library experience. As I noted earlier, 69% of survey respondents to that 2016 Pew survey believe that libraries are doing a really good job in providing their community with a safe place to hang out. Creating and maintaining a safe library environment requires that library staff are constantly on the lookout for potentially disruptive or dangerous behavior. And they also need to clearly communicate and model the library's expectations for user behavior. And finally, staff need to be empowered to make security decisions on their own when necessary. So library staff need to know when it's okay for them to handle a situation on their own, when they need to contact a supervisor for assistance, and when they need to call 911. And you'll see that a safe environment does include having a code of conduct policy and posting the code of conduct policy so that your patrons know what those expectations are. And speaking of signs, signs in the library should be used to communicate library policies and guide user behavior in a respectful and positive manner. And, looking at these three signs, which one do you feel is respectful and positive? Yeah, I would say it's definitely the middle one. The other two are rather insulting, actually. And I do want to add a few more comments that people added in the chat about things that they're seeing in the library. We have someone's mentioned that they've seen a lot of intoxicated patrons in the library, but they're not violent, but they are annoying. And we have another person saying that people hiding things in the library. So in the book, Helping the Difficult Library Patron, New Approaches to Examining and Resolving a Long-Standing and Ongoing Problem, a problem patron is defined as someone who infringes on others' enjoyment of a library by displaying behavior that's deemed destructive, criminal, bothersome, offensive, or otherwise inappropriate to the norms of the behavior in libraries or society. And examples of problematic behavior are anger, aggression, rudeness, harassment of the library staff, destruction of property, also unattended children, sleeping in the library, people using the library restrooms for bathing. And when we look at these problematic behaviors, there's really three levels. So there's the harmless nuisances, there's disruptive or threatening, and then there's the violent behavior. So, harmless nuisance could be the 8-year-old boy who keeps coming to the search desk every 3 minutes asking for your attention. Even though you've showed him several times how to locate materials in the library. Disruptive or threatening, whether someone verbally states that they're going to threaten a staff member, whether they're slamming the mouse down at the computer, public internet terminal, just, really making the other people feeling very unsecure. Those are signs of a disruptive or threatening behavior. And then violent, if somebody's actually attacking staff, a staff member or another patron, such as in Robert's examples of the domestic violence that he's been seeing at his library. And keep in mind, when it comes to the harmless nuisances, what you may label as a problem patron, another member of staff may absolutely find that person, adorable. They love the 8-year-old kid who's constantly asking for their opinion, and they're really more than happy to help him. So the question is, how do you respond to problem patrons? And go ahead and share your answers or ideas or how you handle it in the chat box. Or also, if you'd just like to let us know, you can use your mic. And I'll mute my mic. So the question is, how do you respond to problem patrons? Okay, so we have, in Austin, we use the guideline of first informing the patron of the policies and warning, and followed by eviction if needed. Kathy, my greatest problem is the intoxicated patron who is just annoying. I tell them that they are intoxicated, they will have to leave the library and come back when they are sober. And Rachel says it really depends on the situation, of course. And so that's true. It is dependent on the situation. I think it's important, to always follow the golden rule. You want to treat people the way you'd like to be treated. So you want to remain calm and listen to them attentively, if that's possible. You want to maintain a respectful, professional manner. Definitely want to pay attention to your own tone of voice. I know that when someone is yelling at you, it's really hard to maintain that neutral tone of voice. That's something that I personally struggle with. If possible, you want to paraphrase using the patron's own words to summarize the problem. And if possible, you might want to give them an out. Just say, hey, it looks like your things aren't working out well for you today. Maybe you want to come back tomorrow. That would really depend on the patron and the situation. And then, as Andrew mentioned, you definitely want to provide them with a written copy of the rules. And then we have from Rachel, we try to make sure they know why this is a problem. And again, I think it's always important to, focus on the problem and not the patron if you can. So anyone who's worked at a search desk has probably had one situation where they've had a patron just go off. and handling a very loud, angry patron can be really difficult. When you are dealing with someone in a situation like this, again, you want to lower your voice because often this will bring that other person's voice down. And calmly ask them to lower the voice. You want to watch your own body language. You don't want to appear threatening. You don't want to loom over somebody. Don't want to stand too close to them. It's always best to kind of stand aside and try to remain casual and relaxed. If you do have to ask them to leave, you want to focus on the fact that this has to do with the rule that they weren't following. It's not a personal thing, but that you have these rules and you have to enforce them. and that when they can come back the next day, depending again on the situation. So sometimes, I've had people who get really angry because they had a fine and they swore up and down that the book was in the library and they shouldn't have to pay this fine or this lost book or whatever. I haven't witnessed this, but I know that sometimes when it's possible that if you ask someone to renew an item and they can't renew the item, they can possibly throw it at the staff. I have had incidents when I witnessed the incidents when a staff member was trying to help someone using the Xerox machine, and they were in a hurry and extremely agitated, and she was just trying to walk them through the process, and they just went off on her, and just it was a very sad thing to witness. So it can happen in all kinds of different ways. Again, the best thing to do is try to maintain that neutral presence if possible. So do we create problem patrons by failing to appreciate their needs? Well, that was a question I saw in one of the texts I was looking at to review for this webinar. And I think it is important to step back and ask ourselves, are they really problem patrons, or are they patrons with problems? And, if they're homeless, they probably really don't have anywhere else to go. If they're hungry, they probably are irritable. I don't know about you, but I get irritable when I'm hungry. If they're tired and they're sleeping in the library, it may be the only safe place where they feel they actually can nod off. And if they don't have access to running water or privacy, then they probably are going to be trying to bathe in your bathroom. So some libraries are trying to attempt to combat the root cause of problematic patron behavior through outreach. For instance, the Lusac Library, in partnership with the University of Alaska Anchorage, has a social worker intern working at the library twice a week to assist patrons with job searching, housing assistance programs, and food. So policies, procedures, and practice. I think it's important to just differentiate between the three of those. I know policies and procedures people often confuse. So a policy serves as the guiding principle for decisions and actions, and policies are designed to help staff deal with particular issues or problems that have arisen or are likely to arise. For instance, your library may have a policy where you allow covered beverages to be consumed in your library. Procedures are step-by-step action guides that standardize the methods by which repetitive tasks are performed, and procedures are usually created by staff, and they change as the routine of work changes, so you probably all have a set of procedures you follow for issuing library cards. Practice is how things are actually handled or done at your library on a daily basis, and these practices may or may not support your library policies. Practices should be monitored regularly to ensure that they comply with policy. So maybe your library has a policy for only allowing covered drinks in the library, but staff tend to ignore patrons who also bring in food and eat in the library. In that case, then you would probably want to revise your policy one way or the other. Either revise the policy or enforce the one you have on the books. So these are some reasons why policies are important. Can you think of any other reasons policies are important? And if so, you can add them to the chat box. And then secondly, as you're looking at these policies, which of these do you think are most important to your governing authority? And you can share in the chat box or share on with the mic. Right, and somebody has mentioned liability. And someone else said protect staff and provide consistency. So you're right. It definitely, I think, from the governing authority may be concerned about liability. I think if you're a staff member, you might believe that policies are important because it clarifies relationships and responsibilities within the organization and that delegation of authority down to the lower levels of the organization. I think if you're a patron, this part about protecting the rights of individuals inside and outside the organization might be of interest to you. And then, of course, if you're the director, all of this would be very important. So frontline staff are often the people who have to implement or enforce the policies. So new policies, they really need to be posted, and you may want to have your staff read and initial any new policy that's enacted to ensure that they fully understand it. Patron conduct policies, collection development policies, use of facility policies. I think I would recommend that you post those online so the public can have access to those policies because they really would want to know what those are. You know, any library policy must withstand a legal review, so policies should be clearly written and reasonable. And in fact, the policy may only be enforceable if it is in writing and has been adopted by the library's governing authority. And the governing authority for the library could be the library board or the city or the borough. And the policy is generally considered to be operational and legal the day it is signed until it is revised or deleted. And again, you would want to periodically evaluate to determine whether the policy should be revised or retained. And again, the best policy is to develop a policy before there is a problem. So there's 4 validity tests for policies: legality, reasonableness, and non-discriminatory application, and measurability. So an example of legality test would be if you had a policy that said no pets or animals were allowed in the library. Well, that wouldn't be legal because you would have to refuse entry for people that have service support animals. And so that's not a policy that would meet that validity test for legality. An example is reasonableness. If, for instance, your library changed their hours from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Monday through Friday, well, people who work wouldn't be able to use the library, so that's really an unreasonable policy. So it would fail that validity test. If you had a no sleeping policy which specifically targeted the homeless population, for instance, if you have college students who nod off, late in the evening they're studying for the exam or something, they nod off and you just ignore them. Or if you have the elderly who nod off when they're reading a magazine or newspaper or whatever, and you don't approach them, that would be a non-discriminatory application. And then measurability. So if you had a policy that said that patrons will lose their library privileges if they have too many overdue items, but you fail to define how many is too many. Is it 3 items? Is it 8 items? Is it 20 items? Well, again, that would fail that validity test. So just a quick review of kind of what we've talked about so far. I'm going to go ahead and switch roles here so that Andrew can take over the presentation. But before I do that, I just want to let you know that all the resources that I used on this webinar are in here, and we are recording the webinar, and we will also be posting a link to the webinar slides in a PDF so that you can have them there as well. So, Andrew and Mike.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here talking about this issue. I'm going to talk about some research I did last summer, but just to provide a little context and background first. I just want to say it's important to remember library values when writing policies and to make sure the policies reflect the library goals. As library advocates, we're quick to talk about how beneficial the library is to empower people and provide great resources to people. But I think it's also important for us to understand what kind of impact we can have on vulnerable populations. In Austin, we used an example of a situation, we called the story From Cheetos to Jail. And the short story is somebody was eating a bag of Cheetos and he ended up in jail that night. So enforcing the policies is also something to be really considerate about. I won't get hung up on that issue, but calling the police is an easy answer sometimes, but it
can make a really big difference in somebody's life when that has to turn into that situation. And just to give a little bit of background before my research, I want to address a relatively famous case involving a homeless individual that was evicted from a library in New Jersey for smelling bad. And he sued the library and won under the First Amendment violation of denying him access to information. And a year later, after the city had already settled with the individual, the ruling was reversed by a federal appeals panel. But the entire issue from the initial ruling and the appeals centered around the vague language of the policy. The original judge that determined the library violated the individual's constitutional rights thought the language of the policy was too vague and too subjective for people to enforce equally to everybody. The appeals panel thought the wording was fine, and potentially this could have gone to the Supreme Court had the plaintiff pursued that process, but he had already gotten his settlement and just didn't get tied up in that. But I'm sharing this just to provide more context to think about the possible outcomes of not just writing policies, but the actions you take when you implement the policies too. And so last year I analyzed the Code of Conduct library policies from the 100 most populated cities in the country. And then I even did a more involved analysis of public records of incident reports from 40 of those libraries where people were evicted for smelling bad. And I was looking at that to verify what the Bardolph article argued is that policies disproportionately affect people that are homeless. And I wanted to kind of look through those public records of people being evicted for odor issues to verify that. And the other article there just had previously identified policies that discriminate against people that are homeless. So that's really what I was looking at. And I'm going to go through some of the common policies and just share some of the language that some libraries use that is good and some that is bad, and some of the anomalies of all of the policies. So sleeping is a pretty common policy. Austin, where I used to work, allows children to sleep, but no one else. And it's easy to understand why we might allow people very young to sleep. But it does open the door of possible interpretation of discrimination when you're saying one type of person can sleep and another can't. I think all of us would agree that people that are older in age would probably be tolerated as well. And I think people that are homeless could make a fair argument that it would be a reasonable accommodation to allow them to sleep just on the basis that sleep is a physiological need to survive. And if they're not able to sleep anywhere else, I think that's pretty good legs to stand on. And again, just thinking about the language of what you write, Minneapolis has pretty positive language, I feel. It kind of says some sleeping's okay, some is not, so that's a little bit vague, but it kind of identifies what the staff feel is respectable or not. And that gets into a judgment call, and some people are comfortable with that, some aren't. In Anaheim, much like a lot of small libraries, has a policy preventing snoring but not sleeping. And I think that's another one that I like if you don't have bigger problems with people perhaps passed out because of substance abuse or things like that. That's one approach. Using restrooms for hygiene is, I think, in my findings, a really good example of what to do and what not to do. Omaha's language, just saying to use the facilities properly, is very vague. It doesn't really identify what's allowed and what's not allowed. San Antonio is kind of similar. It says use intended purpose only, but most of us would probably agree that bathing and shaving is the intended purpose of a restroom. And that leaves some area where you might get some pushback from customers when enforcing the policy. And especially if that individual has nowhere else to do those things. I think it's a pretty undignified act to use a public library and restroom to shave. But I also sometimes feel that that person is using their best opportunity to do that. And if that happens to be a library bathroom, I'm not quite saying we should make exceptions for that, but just to be understanding of that when you have to address it with the customer and to treat them with as much dignity as you can when they're already doing something undignified. I do really like the language of the San Diego policy for a couple of reasons. One is it says very explicitly what is allowed. And so right away it does not leave any room for interpretation. But it's also very positive. Instead of saying you can't do this, you can't do that, it's saying what you can do. So for this particular policy, I think what San Diego does is the language that everybody should be using. It just says what the need is and approaches it from a positive perspective. And of course, with all policies, you can't quite do that. If you just think about sleeping, you can't say must stay awake in the library. I mean, you can say must, but if you say people are allowed to stay awake, then that sounds kind of funny. Bags and bulky items is one of the policies that is pretty common, at least in the lower 48, at the highest populated cities. And this is one that I think pretty clearly is discriminatory against people that are homeless. And Chicago kind of uses two of the common themes in the varied policies, which is quantity and size. And basically, Chicago's policy allows, say, a traveling businessman with their carry-on luggage to come in, but not other people with bags. So I think in that case it's pretty clear who's allowed in there and who isn't. And that's a general thing you would want to avoid for any policy. And as you can see from some of the other examples, people even are a lot less vague and prohibit garbage and bags of clothes, which of course makes sense. Nobody wants anybody bringing in bags of garbage into the library, but it's also pretty clearly discriminatory. Bedrolls, blankets, and sleeping bags is one that might be a little bit different up here in Alaska versus what I'm used to, because I'm assuming there's a lot more backpacking and things like that happening here. But in the bigger cities, it's pretty clearly targeting people that are walking around with their house, essentially, or their sleeping quarters for the night. And again, Orlando allows children but not adults to have blankets. So that's another one where you're kind of saying the behavior is okay for some people and not others, which just leaves it open to be interpreted as being discriminatory. Shopping carts, of course, is a very common stereotype of people that are homeless. And 30% of the libraries I looked at had a policy preventing them. And I didn't verify it, but I really doubt all 30 of those libraries shared a parking lot with the grocery store. The Santa Ana wording is very wordy, and it basically says every type of wheeled conveyance system except for shopping cart is allowed, when they're really just saying you can't bring a shopping cart in here. They're, I assume, trying to avoid appearing discriminatory, but they're doing a lot of identification of other types of wheeled devices just to get around doing that. And the odor, of course, is a big one, and it relates back to that legal case I mentioned earlier. And the most common language is kind of the sort of updated common language that a case of New Jersey had a little more vague language about it. So now people are identifying body odor more specifically. I know Washington, D.C. also had a case a few years ago where they initially lost the case and had it overruled because of this issue. So it's important to be explicit in what smells bad, and it can be as simple as saying personal hygiene or body odor. Other places identify other items like unclean clothing. And some libraries also include perfume as an offensive odor. And that, of course, is to make it, again, not look as discriminatory. But this was the category that I identified in all those public records. And I did find 2 cases where people were evicted for perfume. It was the same person at the same library. But in all of those other documents, in many cases, people were even identified as homeless in the description of the incident, which, of course, is also important to remember that any type of public record can be accessed by somebody like myself looking at this kind of stuff, so it's important to be careful about what you say. This is a really interesting category in terms of monopolizing space and loitering in a library. It could be argued that anybody in a library is monopolizing space. So some libraries do define what they mean by this. So as you can see, Fort Wayne, Indiana says individuals who are not using library resources or services is loitering. Potentially, a lot of the customers I've encountered that are homeless just use the library to charge their phone. And although electricity is not necessarily commonly listed as a library service, it could certainly be argued that it is. And San Bernardino's walking aimlessly is interesting to me. I kind of imagined a case where I might be, say, reading a poem and it was really powerful and I had to go walk in the stacks and absorb it, and wondered if that would mean I was walking aimlessly or not. I kind of assume they mean people that have mental health issues that make other people feel uncomfortable, but again, that would be kind of discriminatory to flat out say that. And it's just one of those things where it's important to be explicit in what your needs are, but try to avoid being discriminatory. Almost every library prohibits solicitation, but 32% of the libraries I looked at also included the words begging and panhandling, which again is pretty clearly targeting one type of person. And it's totally unnecessary to use those words. If you just have a blanket statement prohibiting solicitation of any kind, then you don't need to use language that is reinforcing stereotypes. So, for example, if you're just preventing begging and panhandling but allowing the Girl Scouts to sell cookies, obviously there's a difference, but just the blanket statement about solicitation kind of covers all that. And I found some anomalies in the language of all the policies, but the one I really want to point out is the Maricopa County Library, which is in the Phoenix area. It does not include Phoenix Public Library, but all the suburbs around it, and it's a very populous area. And out of all the 100 libraries, they are the only one that does not have like a laundry list of details of what you can't do. They just have this single blanket statement. And I called them and asked them about it. So I was wondering if I just wasn't able to find all of their policies, and they said, nope, this is it. And they told me they had never had any problems with it. Meaning when they tell a customer that they're doing something wrong, they've never had an issue where the laundry list of items, or lack of it, was a problem. I do like this, but the one thing I would add, if this was my policy, would be just to make sure the library staff are clearly authorized to make that judgment on what is appropriate or not. And that's a good segue into sort of the takeaways, which is, the fourth bullet point there is to make sure the staff have the authority to make the judgment call of all the policies, just to avoid any arguing from unhappy customers. Of course, to be mindful of the language, like, just using the blanket statement about solicitation instead of using words that are reinforcing stereotypes. And of course, be explicit to avoid interpretation, and that is to avoid being sued. And when you can, be positive and say what you're able to do instead of what you can't do. And that's all I've got.
Okay, well,
And do I need to pass it back over to you?
No, not yet. Before we end the webinar, yes, please. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing this. And now we can kind of just open it up for discussion. There's still a few minutes before the webinar is over, so if people have any specific questions they'd like to ask Andrew, this is the time. Okay, Andrew, I see a question. Oops, it went away. About how should people deal with repeat offenders, like patrons who sneak in cell phone calls repeatedly?
Well, I guess that is sort of the other end of the policy, is to have sort of the implementation end of it. I mentioned earlier when you were presenting in Austin, we approached it by first informing the customer that they were violating the policies and to warn them and then evict them. In a case where somebody already knows the policy, you might already potentially have the mechanism just to ask them to leave. You don't need to do the informing and warning if they already know it. But that kind of would, of course, depend on the particulars of the policies about implementing or enforcing the policy. So each library might have a different procedure for that. In my experience, we did have the authority to skip the inform and warn for people that we very well knew that they already knew about the policy. And we did also have incident reports for any type of policy infractions. We also had the documentation to verify that we had already told them that in the event that we did choose to evict them. So I would definitely say documenting each incident is very important if you need to take it to the next level and look at a criminal trespass situation. But if it is that somebody is on the phone, I guess if this just continued to be an issue with the same individual, you might have to threaten them with that possibility that they would lose their privileges if they can't follow the policies. And it really doesn't matter if it's a small infraction or something more serious. So to that question, what is required for legal documentation? Again, that would be a little dependent on each institution and what kind of procedure you have in place. But again, in Austin, we had incident reports that were public records that documented the situation. And if it's the same person, same problem every day of the week, and you have to evict them, that's sort of the legal documentation for that, to verify that there's a history of infractions and the person being unwilling to change. So to the question about rural libraries, no, I've not. at least not in this context or that study anyway. Certainly my first impressions of homelessness specifically in Sitka are very different than what I was used to in a bigger city. So I don't have a good feel for that specifically, but I've encountered some of the same problems, such as people drinking in the bathrooms and things like that. And to address the question from Rachel about the abusive and offensive language, I didn't look at that one because it wasn't specific to homelessness in terms of the identified policy as discriminating against them. But it would kind of fall under the same, just procedure of enforcing any policy. And I like the blanket statement of just giving the authority to the staff to make the judgment call of what's appropriate or not. Unless it's a problem with the staff having very different opinions and kind of abusing that authority. But just to avoid interpretation of the policies from the unhappy customers, it's very beneficial.
Okay, so we have a few more comments in the chat, and I'm just reading them aloud so they're recorded. Someone said, I'm concerned about making sure that we support free speech while also making sure patrons aren't disrupting other patrons. And then there's a comment, Julie, can a discussion occur on rural Alaska libraries what to do for addressing these issues since we are unlike all of the other city libraries? And I think that's completely valid, but there are some, I would think, as Andrew stated, there are some similarities. So some of the problematic behaviors are probably happening, but definitely we can set up another webinar. And we have another person says, I agree the rural angle would be great. I believe there was a talk about a pre-conference at ACLA for addressing these issues. Okay. All right. Well, folks, are there any other questions for Andrew? I hear typing.
Right.
Okay. So, Andrew, if you will switch back the control just so that I can access the record. Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And again, I really want to thank Andrew. You know, he hasn't been in Alaska very long, but he was more than willing to share his expertise, and I know he spent a lot of time on this, so I really am appreciative of that. And if you would like to ever facilitate or be a guest presenter on one of our Public Librarians chat, I would be more than willing to talk to you about any topic that you'd like to share with the wider Alaska library land. So thanks, Andrew, and thanks, everybody, and hope everyone has a great day.